The Arizona desert sun burned mercilessly over the small town of Copper Creek, its dusty streets empty except for the occasional tumbleweed rolling lazily in the hot wind. It was 1887, and the law still struggled to establish itself in these wild lands. Jack Raven Morrison adjusted his hat over tired eyes as his black mare slowly advanced down the main street. His worn boots swayed in the stirrup, and the Colt 45 on his hip weighed familiar against his thigh. At 35, Jack carried on his face the marks of 15 years running from the law, scars, premature wrinkles, and eyes that had seen too much. Wanted dead or alive, Jack Morrison, $2,000 reward. The posters with his face were nailed to every post in town. He smiled bitterly. $2,000. That wasn't small money in those times. Jack stopped in front of the town's only saloon, the Golden Desert. He needed supplies and whiskey, always whiskey to ease the cold, lonely nights in the desert. He dismounted and tied the reins, his spurs jingling against the worn wooden planks of the sidewalk. That's when he saw her. Sitting in the shade between two buildings, a little girl of maybe 6 or 7 years old looked at him with eyes as blue as the desert sky. Her little dress was torn and dirty, her blonde hair tangled by wind and neglect. She clutched tightly to a rag doll, even more deteriorated than her clothes. Jack stopped. Something in those eyes hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't fear, it was hope. Pure, desperate hope. "Hey there, little one," he said, his rough voice breaking the silence. "Where are your folks?" The girl stood up slowly, her bare feet touching the hot earth. She approached him without hesitation, without the natural fear a child should have of an armed stranger. "I don't have a daddy or mommy," she said with a sweet, melancholy voice. "They went to heaven with the angel." Jack felt a tightness in his chest. "And where are you staying, girl?" "Nowhere," she replied simply. "I'm waiting for someone to take me home." She moved even closer and without warning extended her small, dirty hand to touch his. The touch was like an electric shock through his hardened soul. "You look strong," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "You look like you can take care of someone." Jack swallowed hard. His hands, which had drawn guns against desperate men, trembled slightly. "Little one, I'm not the kind of man who—" "You're my daddy now," she said suddenly, her words cutting through the hot air like a blade. "You're my daddy now." Jack's world stopped. The words echoed in his mind like rifle shots. He looked down at this tiny child who gazed at him with absolute confidence and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not fear of bullets or the gallows, but fear of disappointing someone who believed in him. "Girl, he began, but the words died in his throat. Across the street, curtains in a window moved. Jack saw the metallic glint of a rifle. His survival instinct screamed in his ears. Bounty hunters, 3 of them, strategically positioned around the square. "Damn," he muttered quietly. The little girl noticed his tension. "What's wrong, Daddy?" "Daddy." The word hit his heart like never before. Jack looked at her, then at the hunters positioning themselves, and made a decision that would change his life forever. "Hold on to me, little one, and don't let go, no matter what happens." The tension in the air was as palpable as the desert heat. Jack lifted the girl into his arms, her weight familiar and completely strange at the same time. She nestled against his chest, trusting, while he quickly calculated his options. "Jack Morrison!" The harsh voice cut through the afternoon silence. "We know it's you! Come out with your hands up!" The leader of the bounty hunters, a tall, thin man with a black hat, emerged from the shadows. His 2 partners flanked the street, rifles aimed. Jack recognized the type. Men desperate for easy money, with no scruples about killing in populated territory. "What's happening?" whispered the little girl, her small hands gripping Jack's shirt. "Nothing you need to worry about, little one," Jack murmured. But his mind was racing. He was cornered, and now he had something much more precious than his own life to protect. "Leave the girl and surrender, Morrison. We don't want to hurt the child." Jack felt rage boil in his veins. These men didn't care about the girl's safety. They just wanted to avoid complications to collect the reward. "Listen here," Jack shouted back, walking slowly toward his horse, the child still in his arms. "This is my daughter. You're not going to hurt her." "Your daughter?" The leader laughed cruelly. "Jack Morrison doesn't have family. Everyone knows that." "Well," Jack said, his voice becoming dangerously low, "everyone is wrong." At that moment, the little girl lifted her head and looked at the armed men with impressive seriousness for her age. "Don't mess with my daddy," she said with a clear, firm voice. "He's going to protect me." The absolute confidence in her voice hit Jack like lightning. This child, who hadn't known him for even an hour, had more faith in him than he'd had in himself for years. The bounty hunter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Girl, that man is a dangerous criminal. He's not your father." "Yes, he is," she insisted, hugging Jack tighter. "And daddies protect their daughters." Jack felt something break inside his chest, a wall he had built over years of loneliness and violence. He looked down at those blue eyes full of hope and knew there was no turning back. "What's your name, little one?" he asked softly. "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah May." "Well, Sarah May," Jack said, climbing into the saddle with her still in his arms. "Let's get out of here." "Stop right there, Morrison!" The first shot came from the right. Jack spurred his mare, protecting Sarah with his body as they galloped down the dusty street. More shots exploded behind them, but he kept his head low, whispering reassuring words in Sarah's ear. "It's okay, little one. Daddy's going to take care of you." Daddy. He had said it, and for the first time in his life the word felt right. As they rode away from Copper Creek, Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just his life at stake anymore. He had a daughter now, not by blood, but by choice. And that choice would change everything. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of hooves. Jack looked at the endless horizon ahead, then at the little girl in his arms. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't running just for himself. "Home, Sarah," he said, and realized he truly believed it. "We're going home." 3 days had passed since they left Copper Creek, the Sonoran desert sun punished mercilessly as Jack and Sarah rode across the vast arid plains. Saguaro cacti rose like silent sentinels, and the hot wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth. Sarah had adapted to life in the saddle with the impressive resilience of a child. She didn't complain about the heat, thirst, or scarce food. Instead, she hummed softly songs her mother had taught her and asked questions that broke down Jack's defenses one by one. "Daddy, why were those men angry with you?" she asked, as they stopped near a shallow stream to water the horses. Jack sighed, kneeling to fill his canteen. How to explain a life of crime to a child? How to tell her he had robbed banks, participated in shootouts, left men dead in the dust? "I did bad things, Sarah," he said finally, his voice heavy with weight. "Things I shouldn't have done." Sarah tilted her head, her blue eyes studying him. "But you're not bad anymore, are you?" The simple question hit him like a punch. "How do you know that?" "Because you saved me," she said with a child's direct logic. "And because your eyes are kind when you look at me." Jack swallowed hard. No one had called his eyes kind in his entire life. That night they camped in a small cave in the Rocky Mountains. Jack made a small fire, keeping it low to avoid attracting attention. Sarah snuggled against him, her rag doll pressed to her chest. "Daddy," she whispered in the darkness. "Yes, little one? Are you going to leave me?" The question cut deeper than any bullet. Jack looked down at the small, vulnerable face illuminated by the dancing flames. "No," he said, and realized it was the first promise he'd made in years that he actually intended to keep. "I'll never leave you." Sarah smiled and closed her eyes, finally relaxing into deep sleep. Jack stayed awake, watching the stars and reflecting on his life. He had been Jack Raven Morrison, a name that made grown men tremble with fear. But now he was just Daddy, and Daddy was better than any reputation he'd ever had. The sound of distant hooves alerted him before dawn. Jack gently woke Sarah, extinguished the fire's embers, and prepared them to ride again. "Are the bad men coming?" Sarah asked, her voice too calm for a child. "Yes, little one, but we're not going to let them catch us." They rode hard for the next 2 days. Jack knew the territory, every canyon, every water source, every goat trail in the mountains. But the bounty hunters were persistent, and Jack could feel the distance between them shrinking. It was on the 5th day that Jack's mare began to limp. A stone had injured her hoof, and she couldn't continue at the necessary pace. Jack stopped near a small abandoned settlement, just a few ruined buildings from an old silver mine. He examined the mare's hoof and knew they needed time to heal. "We'll have to stop for a few hours," he told Sarah, helping her down. Sarah explored the abandoned buildings with a child's natural curiosity, while Jack treated the mare's injury. That's when she found the small ruined chapel at the end of the ghost town's street. "Daddy!" she shouted, excited. "Come see!" Jack followed her to the chapel. The roof had partially collapsed, but a small wooden altar still remained intact. Sarah was kneeling before it, her small hands clasped in prayer. "What are you doing, little one?" "Praying for God to keep us safe," she said simply. "Mama always said God takes care of lost people." Jack knelt beside her, uncomfortable, but moved by something he couldn't name. He hadn't prayed since childhood, before life hardened him. "God," Sarah whispered, "please keep my daddy safe." "He's trying to be good now." The simple, sincere words touched something deep in Jack's soul. When Sarah finished, he placed his hand on her small shoulder. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I promise you I'll be the man you deserve to have as a father, no matter what happens." Sarah smiled and kissed his rough cheek. "I know, Daddy. I always knew." The sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Jack stood quickly, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "They found us," he murmured. But this time Jack Morrison wasn't running just to save his own life. He was running to protect the daughter he had chosen, and that difference would change everything. The final confrontation happened at sunset, when the Arizona sky painted itself in golden and crimson tones. Jack had taken Sarah to the top of a small rocky mesa, a defensible location with a view of the plains below. The 3 bounty hunters positioned themselves at the base of the rock formation, their rifles glinting in the twilight. Jack could see them clearly, desperate, greedy men who didn't understand what had changed in him. "Morrison!" shouted the leader. "Last chance! Come down with your hands up!" Jack checked his Colt one last time, then knelt beside Sarah, who was hidden behind a large rock. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said, his large, calloused hands holding her small face. "No matter what happens down there, you stay here. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. You're coming back, aren't you?" Sarah's blue eyes were full of tears, but she was trying to be brave. Jack felt his heart breaking. He didn't know if he would return. 3 against 1 weren't good odds, even for someone with his experience. "I'm going to try, little one. I'm going to try with everything I have." "Daddy," Sarah said, holding his hand, "remember the prayer in the chapel?" Jack nodded. "God is going to take care of you. I know he will." Sarah's simple, absolute faith gave Jack a strength he didn't know he possessed. He kissed her forehead and stood up. "I love you, Sarah May," he said, the words coming naturally for the first time in his life. "I love you too, Daddy." Jack descended through the rocks, his boots finding footing on the familiar points he had mentally marked. When he reached the plain, the 3 men waited for him in a semicircular line. "Smart of you to come down, Morrison," said the leader, a cruel smile on his face. "Where's the girl?" "Far from here," Jack lied. "And she's going to stay that way." "Doesn't matter. $2,000 is $2,000, with or without the child." The leader gave a signal, and Jack knew there would be no negotiation. They were going to try to kill him where he stood. But something had changed in Jack Morrison. He was no longer the desperate young man who had started a life of crime at 20. He was no longer the bitter man who had lived only to survive. He was a father now, and fathers do the impossible to protect their children. The shootout lasted less than 30 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Jack moved with precision and speed he didn't know he still possessed. The first hunter fell before he could even fully draw his weapon. The second managed a shot, but missed by inches. Jack didn't miss. The leader was more experienced. He managed to take cover behind a rock and keep Jack under fire for several minutes. It was a duel of patience and skill, each man waiting for the other to make a mistake. But Jack had something the other man didn't, a reason to live that was greater than the fear of death. When the final gunshot echoed across the desert, Jack was standing, wounded but alive. A bullet had grazed his arm, and he was bleeding, but he was alive. "Daddy!" Sarah screamed from atop the rocks, and Jack had never heard a sweeter sound. 2 weeks later, Jack and Sarah arrived at a small town in New Mexico called Esperanza. It was a place where no one knew them, where Jack Morrison could die and a new man could be born. Jack used the money he had saved over the years to buy a small property on the outskirts of town. He introduced himself as John Miller, a widower with a daughter coming from Texas in search of a new beginning. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Some days Jack woke up with the old nightmares. Some days he felt the familiar itch to take to the road and run. But whenever those feelings arose, Sarah was there with a smile, with a question, with a hug that reminded him of who he had chosen to be. Jack learned to be a farmer. He learned to raise chickens and plant corn. He learned to participate in church picnics and greet neighbors on the street. He learned to read stories to Sarah before bed and braid her golden hair for school. 6 months after arriving in Esperanza, Sarah ran home from school with a paper in her hand. "Daddy, Daddy, look at this!" she shouted, waving a sheet with colorful drawings. It was a drawing of a family, a tall man in a hat, a little girl in a blue dress, a small house with a white fence, and a bright yellow sun in the sky. "It's us," Sarah explained proudly. "The teacher asked us to draw our family." Jack looked at the drawing, his throat tight with emotion. In the bottom corner, in large, clumsy letters, Sarah had written, "My daddy is the best in the world." "It's beautiful, little one," Jack said, lifting her into his arms. "It's perfect." That night, after putting Sarah to bed, Jack went out to the porch of his small house. The stars shone in the clear desert sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and the flowers Sarah had planted in the garden. Jack Morrison, the outlaw, had died in that shootout in the desert. John Miller, the father, had been born the moment an orphaned little girl had looked into his eyes and said, "You're my daddy now." And for the first time in his life, Jack knew exactly who he was. He was daddy, and that was enough. The legacy of a changed heart. The autumn of 1893 painted the New Mexico landscape in shades of gold and amber. The cottonwood trees that lined the small creek running through John Miller's property swayed gently in the crisp morning breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to the clear desert sky. Sarah May Miller, now 12 years old, sat on the wooden fence that bordered their modest ranch, her long blonde hair catching the early sunlight like spun gold. She wore a simple blue dress that John had carefully mended the night before, and her feet, now properly shod in leather boots he'd bought from the town cobbler, swung rhythmically as she watched the horizon. "Papa!" she called out, using the name that had evolved naturally over their years together. "Mrs. Henderson is coming up the road." John looked up from where he was repairing a section of the chicken coop, his weathered hands pausing in their work. At 40, his face carried the lines of a man who had lived hard, but found peace. The harsh edges that had once defined Jack Morrison's features had softened into something warmer, more approachable. His hair, now touched with grey at the temples, was always neatly combed, and his clothes, though simple, were clean and well-maintained. "Wonder what brings her out this early," John mused, wiping his hands on his work apron. Margaret Henderson was the closest thing Esperanza had to a mayor's wife, a formidable woman who ran the town's social calendar with military precision. Sarah hopped down from the fence with the easy grace of a child who had learned to be comfortable in her own skin. Maybe it's about the harvest festival. I heard in town that they're looking for volunteers to help with the decorations. Could be, John agreed, though something in Mrs. Henderson's purposeful stride suggested this wasn't a social call. Margaret Henderson was a woman of substantial presence, both physically and socially. She wore her authority like her Sunday hat, prominently displayed and impossible to ignore. As she approached the front porch where John and Sarah now waited, her expression was serious but not unkind. "Good morning, Mr. Miller, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency that made her such an effective organizer of community affairs. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," John replied, removing his hat in the automatic gesture of respect that had become second nature. "What brings you our way?" Margaret glanced at Sarah, then back at John. "I was hoping we might have a word in private, Mr. Miller. It's a delicate matter." Sarah's bright blue eyes, now even more striking in her maturing face, flicked between the adults with the quick intelligence that had always characterized her. "I'll go check on the horses, Papa," she said tactfully, understanding without being told that this was adult business. "Good girl," John said softly, his pride in her perceptiveness evident in his voice. When Sarah had disappeared around the corner of the house, Margaret Henderson's expression became even more serious. "Mr. Miller, I'll get straight to the point. I received a telegram yesterday from a man claiming to be a federal marshal. He's asking questions about you." John felt his blood turn to ice, but years of practice had taught him to keep his face neutral. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know if anyone matching your description had settled in our area around 1887 or 1888. Specifically, a man traveling with a young girl." Margaret's sharp eyes studied John's face carefully. "I told him I'd never heard of anyone fitting that description." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. John's mind raced through possibilities, calculating risks, old habits of survival reasserting themselves despite the peaceful years that had passed. "Mrs. Henderson," John said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "why are you telling me this, and why did you lie to a federal marshal?" Margaret Henderson straightened her considerable frame and looked John directly in the eyes. "Because, Mr. Miller, in the 5 years you've been in this town, you've been nothing but a model citizen. You've helped build our school, contributed to our church, assisted neighbors in times of need, and raised that sweet girl with more love and care than many natural fathers show their children." She paused, her voice softening slightly. "I don't know what you might have done before you came to Esperanza, and frankly, I don't want to know. What I do know is who you are now. And who you are now is the kind of man this community needs." John felt his throat tighten with emotions he couldn't name. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Henderson, more than you know." "There's more," she continued. "The marshal is planning to visit Esperanza personally. He'll be here within the week. I thought you should know." The weight of the news settled on John's shoulders like a familiar burden. For 5 years he had allowed himself to believe that Jack Morrison was truly dead, that the past could remain buried under the simple life he had built. But the past, it seemed, had a way of refusing to stay buried. "What will you tell him when he arrives?" John asked. "The same thing I told him in my reply telegram, that no one matching that description has ever settled in Esperanza." Margaret's expression was resolute. "But Mr. Miller, I can't speak for everyone in town. If this marshal starts asking questions publicly—" "I understand," John nodded. "Thank you for the warning." After Margaret left, John stood on his porch for a long time, staring out at the peaceful landscape that had become home. Sarah emerged from behind the house, leading their 2 horses, the old mare that had carried them to safety years ago, now grey-muzzled and gentle, and a younger gelding they had acquired to help with farm work. "Is everything all right, Papa?" Sarah asked, her perceptive blue eyes noting the tension in his posture. John looked at his daughter, truly his daughter in every way that mattered, and felt his heart constrict. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, intelligent and kind, with a strength that reminded him daily of the courage she had shown as a frightened 6-year-old. She was everything good about his life, everything worth protecting. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but serious, "do you remember much about before we came here?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Some things. I remember being scared and alone. I remember the day I met you, and how safe you made me feel. I remember the men who were chasing us, and how you protected me." She paused, studying his face. "Why?" "Because there might be more men coming," John said honestly. "Men who are looking for who I used to be." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then stepped closer and took his hand, a gesture that had comforted them both countless times over the years. "Papa, I don't care who you used to be. I only care about who you are. And who you are is the best father any girl could ever ask for." John squeezed her hand gently. "What if we had to leave again? Start over somewhere new?" "Then we'd do it together," Sarah said without hesitation, "just like we always have." That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, John sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a difficult decision. On the table before him lay 2 items. A letter he had been writing to the town's pastor, explaining the truth about his past and asking him to look after Sarah if anything happened, and his old Colt 45, cleaned and loaded for the first time in 5 years. He picked up the letter and read it again, his own handwriting looking strange and formal in the lamplight. In it, he had told the complete truth about Jack Morrison, about the crimes and the running, about finding Sarah and choosing to become someone better. He had also made arrangements for Sarah's care, including a substantial sum of money he had saved over the years. The gun felt heavy and cold in his other hand, a reminder of who he had been and what he was capable of. But as he sat there, in the quiet house that had become home, listening to the soft sounds of Sarah's breathing from her room down the hall, John realized something important. He wasn't the same man who had been running 5 years ago. Jack Morrison had been a man driven by desperation and fear, always looking over his shoulder, always ready to fight or flee. But John Miller was a father, a member of a community, a man with something worth more than survival. John set down the gun and picked up his pen. At the bottom of the letter, he added one final paragraph. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know this. I would rather face whatever comes as the man I've become than run as the man I used to be. Sarah has taught me that love is stronger than fear, and that some things are worth more than life itself. If this is where my story ends, then at least it ends with honor." 3 days later, a tall man in a federal marshal's badge rode into Esperanza. He asked questions, showed old wanted posters, and searched carefully through the town. But the people of Esperanza, from Margaret Henderson to the baker, from the sheriff to the schoolteacher, all gave him the same answer. No one matching that description had ever settled in their town. The marshal left empty-handed, frustrated, but with no evidence to contradict the unified testimony of an entire community. That Sunday, after church services, Pastor Williams approached John with a knowing smile. "Interesting sermon today, don't you think, John? About redemption and second chances?" John smiled back, understanding the message. "Very interesting, Pastor, very true." As they walked home from church, Sarah skipping ahead to chase butterflies in the tall grass, John felt something he had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, exactly who he was meant to be. Jack Morrison, the outlaw, was gone forever. But John Miller, the father, would live on in the love of his daughter, in the respect of his community, and in the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his true purpose. "Papa," Sarah called back to him, "race you to the creek." John Miller laughed, a sound full of joy and free of shadows, and ran after his daughter toward home.